Imagine a sport where the organizers looked at the rulebook, tossed it in a shredder, and then set the shredder on fire. That is effectively what happened in 1966. We are talking about a minor tweak to the regulations or a new formula for engine displacement. We are talking about a complete philosophical abandonment of sanity. There was a time when the only limit on a race car's speed was the bravery of the man behind the wheel and the tensile strength of the metal holding the engine together. It was an era of unchecked ego, unlimited budgets, and a casualty rate that would shut down any modern sporting event before the first commercial break. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the Canadian-American Challenge Cup. If you're someone who believes that racing was better when the cars were dangerous and the drivers were terrified, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, here's the thing about the history of motorsport. Usually, it's a story of restriction. F1 bans ground effects. NASCAR restricts restrictor plates. Le Mans limits fuel consumption. The narrative is almost always about engineers finding loopholes in a cage. But what happens when you remove the cage entirely? What happens when you tell a group of the smartest, most competitive, and slightly unhinged engineers on the planet that they can build whatever they want? You don't just get fast cars, you get monsters. You get the Can-Am series. And to really understand why this matters, we have to look at the landscape of 1965. Picture the scene. In Europe, Formula One was struggling with an identity crisis. They were running 1.5-liter engines. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same displacement as a modern Honda Civic. Sure, they were delicate, precise machines, but they lacked thunder. They were polite. Meanwhile, in North America, the Sports Car Club of America, the SCCA, was sitting on a powder keg. They had a distinct problem. American fans didn't care about sophisticated tiny engines. They wanted noise. They wanted ground-shaking power. And they had a whole lot of American V8s sitting around waiting to be used. So the SCCA teamed up with the Canadian automobile sports clubs and came up with a set of rules called Group 7. Now, you might be thinking, okay, rules mean restrictions. But here's what most people don't realize about Group 7. The rule book was basically 2 sentences long. Rule 1, the car must have 2 seats. Rule 2, the bodywork must enclose the wheels. That was it. No, seriously. There was no limit on engine size, no limit on turbocharging, no limit on supercharging, no limit on aerodynamics. You could use 4 engines if you could figure out how to bolt them together. You could use tires 10 feet wide if you could find someone to mold them. The result was an immediate arms race that makes the Cold War look like a mild disagreement. When the series launched in 1966, the prize fund was $360,000. Now I know, $360K doesn't sound like much today, but you have to adjust for inflation and the economic reality of the 60s. That is roughly equivalent to $3.5 million today for a 6-race season. For comparison, the entire Formula One prize fund was peanuts next to this. Drivers could make more money in one weekend of Can-Am than they could in an entire season of Grand Prix racing. Naturally, the sharks started circling. You had heavy hitters like John Surtees, the only man to win world championships on 2 wheels and 4. You had Phil Hill, America's first F1 champion. And you had a brilliant, soft-spoken Kiwi named Bruce McLaren. But in 1966, the grid wasn't the spaceship-looking grid we remember from the 70s. It was raw. It was mechanical. The weapon of choice was the Lola T70. This is where it gets really interesting. The Lola T70 wasn't a computer-designed masterpiece. It was a sledgehammer. It was a big aluminum bathtub with a Chevrolet V8 bolted to the back. But because there were no rules, the team started doing things that were frankly irresponsible. The standard Chevy small block was 327 cubic inches, or about 5.3 liters. That wasn't enough, so they started boring them out. 5.7 liters, 6 liters. They were running strictly mechanical fuel injection, stacks of trumpets sticking straight up into the airflow. There was no traction control, no power steering, no paddle shifters, just a manual gearbox, 3 pedals, and 500+ horsepower in a car that weighed less than a Volkswagen Beetle. When the green flag dropped at St. Jovite for the first race in 1966, the ground literally shook. Witnesses said the sound was physical. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure waves hitting your chest. John Surtees took that first championship, but the writing was on the wall. The privateers, the guys buying cars from Lola and McLaren, were struggling to keep up with the factory efforts. And this brings us to the first major turning point, the tire war. You see, with unlimited power, the weak link becomes the rubber. In 1966, tires were treaded. They looked like regular car tires, just wider. But with 500 horsepower tearing at the asphalt, they were shredding. Goodyear and Firestone looked at Can-Am and saw a massive marketing opportunity. They started pouring millions into development. By 1967, the tires had become slicks, completely smooth, massive rubber barrels. This allowed the cars to corner at speeds that were previously physically impossible. Here is a stat that will blow your mind. In 1966, a fast lap at Motorsport was maybe a 124. By 1967, with the new tires and bigger engines, they were dropping seconds per lap. Not tenths of a second, whole seconds. The evolution was happening in real time. You could go to a race in June and see a car, and by the time the series came back in September, that same car was obsolete. It was technological Darwinism at its most brutal. But while Lola won the first battle, Bruce McLaren was winning the war. Bruce was a genius engineer, but he was an even better organizer. He realized that to win in Can-Am, you didn't just need a fast car, you needed a system. He painted his cars a bright, shocking papaya orange. Why? Not for aerodynamics, but for psychology. He wanted everyone to see them coming. He wanted that orange color to be the last thing his competitors saw in their mirrors before they were lapped. And lap them he did. The 1967 season introduced the McLaren M6A. This is arguably the most important car in the early history of the series. It was simple, reliable, and terrifyingly fast. While other teams were experimenting with exotic ideas like four-wheel drive or strange aerodynamic flips, McLaren focused on making the car drivable. He understood something the others missed. A 600 horsepower car is useless if the driver is too exhausted to drive it after 10 laps. The M6A had a monocoque chassis bonded with aerospace glue and riveted together. It was stiff, light, and predictable. Denny, Bruce's teammate, was a bear of a man, grumpy, tough, and incredibly sensitive to machinery. Together, the Bruce and Denny show began. They obliterated the 1967 season. They won 5 out of 6 races. It wasn't a competition, it was a demonstration. Now, you might be wondering, where were the Americans in their own series? Well, that brings us to the tragedy of Jim Hall and Chaparral. If Bruce was the pragmatic racer, Jim Hall was the mad scientist. He was an oil tycoon from Texas with an engineering degree and zero fear. He looked at the rulebook, or the lack of one, and saw different things than everyone else. While McLaren was refining the V8, Hall was looking at the air itself. Hall introduced the Chaparral 2E. This thing looked like it had crashed into a Cessna. It had a massive wing mounted on struts 4 feet above the rear deck. But here's the kicker. The wing was movable. The driver had a third pedal in the cockpit. When he was in the corners, the wing was angled down to push the car into the track. When he hit the straight, he would stomp on the pedal, the wing would flatten out, drag would disappear, and the car would rocket forward. It was active aerodynamics 50 years before DRS became a thing in F1. But innovation comes at a cost. The Chaparrals were fragile. They broke, the wings failed, the transmissions, which were automatic, yes, automatic race cars in the 60s, would overheat. Hall proved that being the smartest guy in the room doesn't always mean you win the race. Sometimes being the most consistent guy matters more. And sadly, consistency was about to become a matter of life and death. The speeds were climbing past 180, 190, approaching 200 miles per hour on tracks that were basically country roads lined with trees. The 1968 season opened with a somber tone. The engines were now pushing 7 liters, 427 cubic inches. We're talking about 600 plus horsepower. The standard for bravery was shifting. It wasn't enough to be fast anymore. You had to be willing to wrestle a machine that actively wanted to kill you. The transition from sport to spectacle was complete. And yet, nobody slowed down. The crowds grew. They were seeing 30, 40, 50,000 people show up to watch these orange missiles scream through the woods of Wisconsin and the deserts of California. By 1969, the Can-Am series had stopped being a competition and started being a dynasty. If you were a betting man in the late 60s, the safest investment wasn't gold or real estate, it was putting your money on a Papaya orange car. The Bruce and Denny show was in full swing. They had refined the formula to a terrifying science. The new weapon was the McLaren M8B. And honestly, looking at the stats of the 1969 season is almost boring until you realize the sheer magnitude of the achievement. Here is what most people don't realize about dominance in racing. Usually, dominance means winning the championship by a healthy margin. In 1969, McLaren won every single race. 11 races, 11 wins. They finished 1-2 in 8 of them. It was total, suffocating superiority. The M8B was wider, lower, and featured a massive high wing that sat directly on the suspension uprights, pushing the tires into the track with hundreds of pounds of force. The engines were now officially huge, 7-liter aluminum Chevys producing over 630 horsepower. But unlimited racing has a price. When you push boundaries that haven't been mapped yet, you occasionally step off the edge of the map. And in June 1970, the series and the motorsport world paid the ultimate price. It was a Tuesday at Goodwood Circuit in England. Bruce McLaren was testing the new car for the upcoming season, the M8D. He was a man at the peak of his powers. Driver, engineer, team boss, visionary. He came out of the pits, the big V8 roaring, and headed down the Levant Straight. He was doing roughly 170 miles per hour when the rear bodywork, the entire back section of the car, tore loose. The aerodynamic downforce vanished instantly. The car became an unguided projectile. It spun, hit a flag station, and Bruce was killed instantly. Pause for a second. Imagine the shock. This wasn't just a driver dying. This was the architect of the entire era. The team was devastated. They had lost their leader, their friend, and their engineer. Everyone expected McLaren motor racing to fold. They assumed the doors would close and the orange cars would disappear into history. But here is where the story gets incredibly human. The team didn't quit. They went back to the shop, wiped the tears, and finished the cars. They nicknamed the M8D the Batmobile because of its distinctive high tail fins designed to support the wing without the struts that had failed on Bruce's car. And in the very first race of the 1970 season, just weeks after Bruce died, Dan Gurney drove the M8D to victory. Denny Hulme won the championship. It was the most emotional, gritty performance in racing history. They didn't just win for the prize money, they won to prove that Bruce's vision was still alive. While McLaren was winning with emotion and refinement, our old friend Jim Hall decided to break reality one last time. If you think modern F1 cars are complicated, let me introduce you to the Chaparral 2J. Now, you might be thinking, what could be crazier than a giant wing? How about a car that is literally a vacuum cleaner? The 2J didn't rely on airflow over the car to create downforce. It had 2 massive fans mounted at the back, powered by a separate 2-stroke snowmobile engine. I'm not joking, the car had 2 engines, one to drive the wheels and the loud, buzzing snowmobile engine to drive the fans. The concept was simple but insane. The fans sucked the air out from underneath the car. Skirts made of Lexicon, a type of plastic, dragged along the ground to seal the gap. This created a partial vacuum under the chassis. The result? The car was sucked down to the track with over 1,000 pounds of force even when it was standing still. It changed physics. Normal race cars need speed to generate grip. The slower you go, the less grip you have. The 2J had maximum grip at 0 miles per hour. It could go through a hairpin turn at speeds that defied logic. Drivers following it complained that the fans threw rocks, dust, and debris directly into their faces. It was ugly, it sounded like a chainsaw fighting a thunderstorm, and it was blindingly fast. In qualifying, it was seconds faster than the McLarens. But, as is tradition with Jim Hall, it broke. The snowmobile engine would fail, the skirts would snag, and then the politics started. McLaren, usually the ones pushing the envelope, led the charge to ban it. They argued that the fans constituted a movable aerodynamic device, which was technically forbidden. The SCCA agreed. The 2J was banned after one season. It was the moment Can-Am blinked. For the first time, they said, okay, that's too much. It was a crack in the unlimited philosophy. By 1961, the series was at its absolute peak of naturally aspirated violence. The McLaren M8F was the weapon of choice. The engines had grown to ridiculous proportions. We're talking about 8.1-liter V8s. That is 495 cubic inches. These engines were producing over 740 to 800 horsepower. Let me put that in perspective for you. A modern NASCAR Cup car, with all its technology, makes about 670 horsepower. These cars, in 1971, with no computers, no fuel management, and tires that were basically black balloons, were making nearly 800. The acceleration was savage. They were doing 0 to 100 miles per hour in under 5 seconds. On the straights at tracks like Riverside and Road America, they were hitting 215 miles per hour. The noise was apocalyptic. If you talk to anyone who was at a Can-Am race in 1971, they don't talk about the visual. They talk about the ground shaking. A field of 30 cars, all running 7 or 8-liter V8s, created a resonance that you could feel in your teeth. It was American muscle taken to its absolute logical extreme. The drivers were heroes, but they were also exhausted. The G-forces were climbing. The heat in the cockpits was unbearable, often over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, because the driver was basically sitting inside the engine bay. Denny Hulme, the bear, was suffering from severe burns on his hands just from shifting gears. Peter Revson, the heir to the Revlon Cosmetics fortune and a brilliant driver, took the 1971 championship. It seemed like the party would last forever. The American V8 was king, the McLaren chassis was the throne, and the money kept flowing. But lurking in the background, there was a disturbance in the force. While the Americans and the British were seeing how big they could make a V8 piston, the Germans were in Stuttgart, looking at a rulebook loophole that everyone else had ignored. You see, the rules said unlimited engine displacement. Everyone read that as make the engine bigger. Porsche read it as make the air denser. They had been dominating endurance racing with the 917, a beautiful flat 12 powered coupe. They looked at Can-Am and saw the massive prize money and the massive marketing potential in North America. They tried a naturally aspirated car, the 917 PA, and got their doors blown off by McLaren. They realized to beat 8 liters of American iron, they couldn't just add more cylinders. They needed a force multiplier. They started experimenting with turbocharging. Now, today, every economy car has a turbo. It's standard tech. In the early 70s, turbocharging was black magic. It was used on diesel trucks and airplanes, not race cars. The lag was terrible. The heat was unmanageable. The throttle response was like a light switch. Nothing, 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 and then explosion. Porsche didn't care. They had unlimited budgets and German stubbornness. They took their 5-liter flat 12 engine and strapped 2 massive Eberspacher turbochargers to it. They started testing. The early results were concerning. The driver said the car was undrivable. The power delivery was so violent it would spin the tires at 150 miles per hour. But they kept refining. They kept tweaking, and as the 1971 season ended, the orange car celebrated another championship, sipping champagne and patting themselves on the back. They didn't realize that the sun was setting on their empire. Across the ocean, in a sterile workshop in Weissach, a monster was breathing for the first time. A monster that wouldn't just beat them, it would annihilate the very concept of the series. Here's the thing about arms races. Eventually, someone brings a nuke to a knife fight. And Porsche was loading the silo. The arrival of the Porsche 91710 in 1972 wasn't just a new car entering the series. It was a regime change. Imagine you've been winning bar fights for 5 years because you're the biggest, strongest guy in the room. You've got a system. You've got confidence. Then, one day, a guy walks in wearing a lab coat and carrying a flamethrower. That is essentially what happened to McLaren. The 1972 season began, and the panic in the paddock was palpable. The Porsche 91710 wasn't perfect yet, but the numbers were terrifying. The turbocharged flat 12 was producing around 850 to 900 horsepower in race trim. But the scary part was qualifying. Porsche engineers discovered that if they turned a little screw on the wastegate, they could dial up the boost. For a few laps, that engine could churn out over 1,000 horsepower. McLaren, the team that had won 5 straight championships, was suddenly fighting for its life. Their 8.1-liter V8s were maxed out. You could only bore out a cylinder block so much before the walls become transparent. They were bringing knives to a gunfight. Mark Donohue was the chosen driver for the Porsche effort, run by the legendary Roger Penske. Donohue was the perfect driver for this era, an engineer with a helmet. He could drive the car, come into the pits, and explain exactly which gear ratio needed changing or how the turbo lag was affecting the exit of Turn 4. But disaster struck early. During testing, the rear bodywork of Donohue's 91710 flew off, a recurring theme in the series, you'll notice, causing a horrific crash that shattered his leg. So who steps in? George Fulmer. Fulmer was an old-school racer. He didn't care about the engineering, he just wanted to go fast. He jumped into this turbocharged dragon of a car and proceeded to tear the series apart. He won 5 races. He won the championship. The Orange and Denny show was canceled. The orange cars were now just colorful traffic for the white, red, and blue Porsches. But if 1972 was the regime change, 1973 was the nuclear winter. Porsche wasn't satisfied with just winning. They wanted to make a statement that would echo through history. They introduced the 91730. This car, look, it's hard to talk about the 91730 without sounding like you're exaggerating. It is widely considered the most powerful road racing car ever built. The engine was enlarged to 5.4 liters. The turbos were optimized. The chassis was lengthened to stabilize the beast at high speeds. Let's talk numbers, because this is where reality starts to blur. In race trim, meaning the setting where the engine had to last for 2 hours, it made 1,100 horsepower. In qualifying trim, where it only needed to survive a few laps, Mark Donohue could twist a knob in the cockpit, affectionately called the steam wheel, and unleash 1,580 horsepower. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's a big number, but let me contextualize that. The car weighed 1,800 pounds. That gives it a power-to-weight ratio that is better than a modern Bugatti Chiron, better than a Formula One car. And remember, this is 1973. No traction control, no ABS. The tires were 19 inches wide at the rear, and they were useless against that kind of power. If Donohue stomped on the gas at 100 miles per hour, the wheels would spin. Mark Donohue didn't just win the 1973 championship, he exterminated the opposition. He won 6 out of 8 races. At some tracks, he wasn't just faster, he was seconds faster. At Elkhart Lake, he qualified over 3 seconds faster than the next car. It was laughable. It was a massacre. But here's what most people don't realize about the 91730. It wasn't just the power, it was the drivability. Porsche had solved the turbo lag. Sort of. They didn't eliminate it, they just taught Donohue how to drive around it. He had to hit the gas before the corner apex, anticipating that the power would arrive 2 seconds later when he was at the exit. It required a level of mental processing that was superhuman. You were driving the car in the future, reacting to things that hadn't happened yet. While Porsche was celebrating, the rest of the grid was going broke. The cost of competing had skyrocketed. To run at the front, you needed a turbocharged program, which cost millions. The privateers, the guys who made up the backbone of the series, packed up and went home. The fields dwindled. The fans, initially awed by the Porsche, started to get bored. Watching one car lap the field twice isn't a race, it's a parade. And then, the world intervened. In October 1973, the oil crisis hit. The price of gas quadrupled. Lines formed at gas stations. Suddenly, a racing series based on cars that got 2 miles per gallon of high-octane fuel seemed obscene. It was bad optics. Sponsors like heavy industry and fuel companies started to pull back. The SCCA, in a desperate attempt to save the show, and frankly to stop the Porsche dominance, introduced a new rule for 1974. They implemented a fuel efficiency limit. The cars had to achieve a certain miles per gallon figure to compete. It was a soft ban. Everyone knew it was targeted directly at the thirst of the 917/30. Porsche looked at the rule, looked at their trophy cabinet, and said, "We're done." They withdrew. McLaren had already left to focus on Formula One and IndyCar. The 1974 season was a ghost town. The final race of the unlimited era was a sad affair. The Shadow team took the title, but the magic was gone. The thunder had faded. The series that had once boasted the biggest prize fund in the world crumbled under its own weight. It was canceled before the 1975 season could even start. So what is the legacy of this madness? Why do we still talk about a racing series that has been dead for 50 years? First, the technology. Can-Am was a laboratory. The things they learned about aerodynamics, about downforce, wings, and ground effects directly influenced Formula One. The turbocharging technology that Porsche perfected went straight into their road cars. If you drive a Porsche 911 Turbo today, its lineage traces directly back to Mark Donohue and the 917/30. They proved that turbos could be reliable and responsive. Second, the safety, or rather the realization of limits. Can-Am proved that there is a limit to what a human can handle. The cars had become faster than the tracks. We learned that you can't just keep adding speed without upgrading the environment. It forced a rethink of track safety, barriers, and car construction. But the real legacy is emotional. Can-Am represents a moment in time that can never be repeated. We will never again see a major racing series with unlimited rules. The world has changed. Liability, insurance, environmental concerns, and cost caps ensure that racing will always be a controlled exercise from now on. Can-Am was the Wild West. It was the last time the frontier was open. It was a time when a guy with a welder and a dream could build a car in his garage and race against factory teams. Okay, he'd lose, but he could race. It was a time when the heroes looked like everyday guys, covered in grease, smoking cigarettes in the pits, and then stepping into 1,000 horsepower coffins to do battle at 200 miles per hour. We look back at it with rose-tinted glasses, sure. We forget the terrible accidents. We forget the financial ruin of the teams that failed. But we remember the noise. We remember the shapes. We remember the audacity of it. Think about it this way. Today we have the technology to build cars that are faster than the 917/30. An F1 car is technically faster around the lap, but an F1 car is a computer on wheels. It's managed, it's optimized. The 917/30 was a sledgehammer. It was raw. It was a test of courage as much as skill. And that brings us to the what if. What if the oil crisis hadn't happened? What if the series had continued? Where would we have gone? Engineers from that era speculate that if Can-Am had continued into the late 70s, we would have seen 2,000 horsepower cars. We would have seen fan cars return. We might have seen speeds approaching 300 miles per hour on the straights. But we also would have seen more tragedies. The human body has limits. G-force blackout is a real thing. Can-Am was approaching the biological ceiling of the driver. In a way, it's good that it died when it did. It died at its peak. It didn't fade away into irrelevance over decades like some other series. It exploded, burned bright, and then vanished, leaving a scorch mark on the history of motorsport that will never fade. The cars are still out there, you know. You can see them at vintage races, and when they fire up a McLaren M8 or a Porsche 917 today, the entire paddock stops. The modern mechanics, working on their hybrid systems and laptops, put down their tools and walk to the fence. They stare, they listen, because deep down, every racer wishes they could have been there. They wish they could have seen the titans walk the earth. This was a story of Can-Am. The story of what happens when you tell engineers, no rules. It was dangerous, it was expensive, it was unsustainable, and it was absolutely glorious. Now, before we wrap up, I want to pivot to something slightly different. we've talked about the machines, but we need to talk about the culture that allowed this to happen. Because Can-Am wasn't just about cars, it was about a specific mindset in North America in the 1960s. It was the era of the moon landing, the era of the SR-71 Blackbird. There was a pervasive belief that technology could solve anything. If you had enough thrust, enough power, enough engineering, you could conquer nature. Can-Am was that philosophy applied to asphalt. It was the automotive equivalent of the Apollo program, excessive, brilliant, and driven by national pride. The rivalries were legendary, not just between teams, but between nations. You had the Americans with their big V8s, brash, loud, simple. You had the British via McLaren with their chassis precision, calculating, organized. And you had the Germans with their high-tech turbo wizardry, clinical, efficient. It was a microcosm of the geopolitical landscape played out on Sunday afternoons. And let's not forget the tracks. Motorsport, Watkins Glen, Road America, Laguna Seca. These weren't the sanitized, flat, tilky-dromes of today with miles of asphalt runoff. These were natural terrain road courses. They had elevation changes. They had bumps. They had trees right next to the track. To drive a 1,000 horsepower car at Motorsport, where you are flying blind over crests at 180 miles per hour, required a lack of imagination. If you imagined what would happen if a tire blew, you couldn't do it. You had to block it out. This brings us to one of the most mysterious and fascinating chapters of the Can-Am saga, the story of Shadow. If McLaren was the clean-cut professional outfit and Porsche was the engineering juggernaut, Shadow was the dark horse, literally. The team was founded by Don Nichols, a man who, let's just say, had a colorful past. Before racing, he served in World War II, then moved to Japan where he allegedly worked for U.S. intelligence. He spoke fluent Japanese, dealt in tires, and walked around the paddock in a black trench coat and a black hat, looking like a villain from a noir film. Nichols didn't just want to race, he wanted to disrupt. In 1970, he unveiled the Shadow Mark I. And unveiled is the right word, because when they pulled the cover off, people laughed. Then they stared in confusion. The car was tiny. I don't mean small, I mean it looked like a go-kart that had been stepped on. Here's the thing about the Mark I. The designer, Trevor Harris, had a radical idea: minimize frontal area to reduce drag. To do that, he decided to use tiny tires. While everyone else was running 24-inch or 26-inch tall tires, the Shadow used tires that were barely 17 inches tall on the front. They looked like wheels from a shopping cart. To fit the driver into this pancake of a car, he had to sit in a semi-reclined position that was practically lying down. The radiator was mounted in the rear wing. Yes, inside the wing to keep the nose clean. It was a disaster. The tiny tires overheated instantly because they had to spin so much faster to cover the same distance. The engine cooling was a nightmare. George Fulmer tested it and basically said, "I'm not driving this death trap." But it showed the spirit of Can-Am. There was no rule saying you couldn't run tiny tires. There was no rule saying you couldn't put radiators in the wing. It failed, sure, but it was a magnificent failure. Shadow eventually switched to a more conventional design and became a front-running team, but that first car remains a symbol of the why not attitude. Now, let's talk about materials. Today we hear about carbon fiber and titanium like they are standard. In the late 60s, these were aerospace materials. You couldn't just buy them at the hardware store. But Can-Am teams were raiding the scrapyards of the aviation industry. Take the Autocoast T22. This is a car that rarely gets mentioned in the history books, but it should. It was built by Peter Bryant in 1969. The TI stood for titanium. The chassis wasn't aluminum, it was made of titanium sheets. Titanium is incredibly strong and light, but it is a nightmare to work with. It catches fire if you grind it wrong, it's brittle if you weld it wrong, it destroys tools. Yet they built a race car out of it. The T22 was lighter than the McLarens and arguably faster in a straight line. Jackie Oliver drove it and was constantly harassing the factory McLarens until the funding ran dry. It proved that a small team with a smart idea could threaten the giants. Let's pivot to the drivers for a moment. We often talk about the cars as the stars, but the men who strapped themselves into these things were operating on a different level of consciousness. You have to understand the ergonomics, or lack thereof. The driver was positioned forward, his feet actually ahead of the front axle line in many cars. Think about that. If you hit a wall, your ankles are the crumple zone. The fuel tanks were panniers sitting on either side of the driver. You were literally sitting in a bathtub of 100-octane gasoline. And remember, these engines were hot. The cockpit temperatures would soar. Drivers would lose 5 to 10 pounds of water weight during a race. They would come out of the car looking like they had gone 12 rounds with a heavyweight boxer, eyes sunken, dehydrated, trembling from the vibration. Vic Elford, a legend who drove the 917-10 and the Chaparral 2J, once described driving a Can-Am car as trying to balance a pencil on your finger while standing in a hammock during an earthquake. The cars had massive grip, but when they let go instantly. There was no slide to catch. You were gripped up, and then you were spinning at 150 miles per hour. This is where it gets really interesting regarding the bravery aspect. It wasn't blind courage, it was calculated risk management. Every corner was a negotiation with physics. At Road America, there's a corner called the kink. It's a terrifyingly fast right-hand bend. In a modern car, it's flat out. In a Can-Am car, you were arriving at 190 miles per hour. The car would get light over the crest. The suspension would get vague. You had to trust that when the suspension compressed again, the tires would bite. If you lifted, the weight transfer would spin you. If you stayed in it, you might run out of road. That decision had to be made in a millisecond, lap after lap. And the visibility? Zero. The rear wings were so huge they filled the mirrors. The tires were so wide they blocked the view to the side. You drove by feel and by sound. Speaking of sound, we need to address the sonic signature of the series. We touched on it earlier, but it's worth diving deeper. The grid was a symphony of chaos. The McLarens had that deep, rhythmic American V8 thunder, a boom, boom, boom that hit you in the gut. The Ferraris, yes, Ferrari dabbled in Can-Am with the 612 and 712, had high-revving V12s that screamed like ripping silk. The Shadows used Chevy engines, but with different exhaust tuning that made a sharper bark. And then the Porsches. The turbos acted like mufflers, so they were quieter, but they made this whooshing, whistling noise, like a jet taking off, followed by a crack of wastegate noise on shifts. When the field took the green flag, it wasn't just loud, it was disorienting. The ground vibration would blur your vision if you were standing too close to the fence. It was a sensory overload that hooked fans for life. You didn't just watch Can-Am, you survived it. Look, there is another misconception we need to clear up. People think Can-Am died solely because of Porsche. While the 917-30 was the nail in the coffin, the series was already sick. The costs were spiraling out of control even before the turbos arrived. McLaren was spending a fortune. The prize money, while high, wasn't covering the R&D. The show was eating itself. To keep the fans interested, the cars had to get faster. To get faster, they became more expensive. As they became more expensive, fewer teams could afford to race. As fewer teams raced, the show got worse. It's the classic paradox of unconstrained capitalism in sports. Without a salary cap or a budget cap, the rich get richer and the poor go home. Can-Am was the ultimate proof that you actually need regulations to save racing from itself. By 1974, when the SCCA imposed the fuel limits, it was almost a mercy killing. The teams were bleeding money. The promoters were struggling to sell tickets to races where the winner was decided in qualifying. The tragedy isn't that it ended. The tragedy is that we haven't learned a lesson. We still see series today try to go unrestricted and hit the same wall. But let's go back to the tech for a second, because I want to mention the brakes. Stopping an 1,800-pound car from 200 miles per hour requires immense energy dissipation. Can-Am pioneered the use of exotic materials in brakes. They used beryllium rotors. They experimented with air brakes, flaps that would pop up. And they routed massive cooling ducts through the bodywork. Here's a stat for you. The Porsche 117-30 could accelerate from 0 to 100 miles per hour in 3.9 seconds, but it could brake from 100 to 0 even faster. The violence of the deceleration was enough to detach retinas. Drivers had to brace their necks against the G-force to keep their heads up under braking. It was a workout that modern gym equipment can barely replicate. And the gearboxes. These were manual transmissions trying to handle 1,000 pound-feet of torque. It was like trying to send a lightning bolt through a wristwatch. The gears were huge, chunky pieces of steel. The drivers had to be precise. One missed shift, one fumbled clutch release, and you would strip the teeth off the gears instantly. DNF. Did not finish. The reliability rate in Can-Am hovered around 50% for the backmarkers. Just finishing was an achievement. There was an attempt to bring it back, of course. People always try to resurrect the dead. In 1977, the SCCA revived the name Can-Am for a new series. But it was a zombie. It was a shadow of the original. The cars were basically Formula 5000 single-seaters with fenders bolted on. They were restricted to 5-liter engines. They were fast, sure, but they weren't monsters. They were polite race cars pretending to be barbarians. The series limped along until 1987, but nobody talks about that era with the same reverence. It proved that you can't legislate magic. You can't write a rulebook that creates a legend. Legends are born in the absence of rules. Now look, here's what gets me every time I look at photos from 1970 or 1972. It's the access. In modern F1, the paddock is a fortress. You need a pass that costs more than a house to get near the cars. In the Can-Am days, the fans were right there. You could walk up to the McLaren trailer, see Bruce or Denny eating a sandwich, and watch the mechanics tearing down a V8. There was no barrier between the gods and the mortals. This intimacy is what built the myth. When you stood 3 feet away from a 917-10 while they warmed it up, you didn't just see a car, you shared a moment with it. You smelled the unburnt hydrocarbons. You felt the heat radiating off the exhaust headers. You saw the fear and the focus in the driver's eyes before he put his helmet on. That connection is gone from modern motorsport, sanitized by corporate hospitality suites and VIP zones. So why does this matter to us today? Why should you, sitting there watching this video in 2026, care about a racing series that ended before most of us were born? Because Can-Am asks a question we are still afraid to answer. How fast is too fast? In a world that is increasingly obsessed with safety, regulation, and efficiency, Can-Am stands as a monument to excess. It reminds us of what humanity is capable of when we take the brakes off. We built machines that could alter the rotation of the Earth, metaphorically at least. We tamed explosions. We rode rockets. It serves as a mirror. We look at the Can-Am era and we see a version of ourselves that was braver, perhaps a bit stupider, but undeniably more alive. We see a time when the pursuit of speed was a noble artistic endeavor, not just a marketing exercise for energy drinks or hybrid technology. The legacy of the Canadian-American Challenge Cup isn't in the trophies or the record books. It's in the DNA of every hypercar that chases a top speed record. It's in the spirit of every garage builder who decides to swap an LS engine into a Miata just to see if it fits. It's the voice in the back of our heads that says, I wonder what would happen if we added just a little more boost. We will likely never see anything like it again. The insurance companies won't allow it. The tracks can't contain it. And frankly, I don't know if we have the stomach for the cost, both financial and human, anymore. And maybe that is a good thing. Maybe we needed to learn that lesson so we could move on to safer, more sustainable forms of racing. But man, what a lesson it was. If you ever get the chance to see a McLaren M8 or a Porsche 917-30 in a museum or at a historic festival, don't just walk past it. Stop. Look at the size of the tires. Look at the flimsy aluminum tub that protected the driver. Look at the size of the turbochargers. And try to imagine what it must have felt like to crest a hill at Motorsport, throttle pinned with 1,500 horsepower, trying to tear the rear axle out of the car, knowing that the only thing keeping you alive was your own reflexes and the thin layer of fiberglass. It was madness. It was beautiful. And it was the greatest show on asphalt. That is the story of the time we decided to play God with internal combustion, and for a few glorious years, we won. The silence that followed the end of Can-Am was deafening. But the echo will last forever. This is legacy motoring. I hope this deep dive gave you a new appreciation for the monsters of the past. If you enjoyed this journey into the golden era of speed, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below telling me which Can-Am car is your favorite, Team McLaren or Team Porsche, and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep telling these stories. Until next time, keep the revs high.